Delighted on this episode to be talking with creator, filmmaker Jason Andrew Cohn. Jason, thank you for joining another Jason on a podcast.
Well, it's great to be here with you, Jason. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely, my pleasure. We've been chatting a little bit before I hit record, and I know that on this episode we're talking about Tezuka, god of manga, and this is Osamu Tezuka. So I'm
Mhm.
curious about what has drawn you to this project. What inspired your interest?
Yeah, so Tezuka is a really well-known figure in post-war, well, really 20th century Japanese culture. And I lived in Japan. I lived in Sapporo for about 4 years, and I was a Japanese history major, modern Japanese history major in college. And so he's just kind of this figure that carries a lot of kind of cultural weight in Japan, and I was always kind of aware of him. Um, and then I just decided I just was kind of done with another project and was always kind of curious about him. I had done a radio story about him actually, and I decided to try to explore it a little bit further and see if it would be possible to sort of expand it into a documentary about him. And then I've sort of subsequently found out that, there's he's sort of considered the wellspring of all sort of contemporary Japanese popular culture. The sort of without him, all this other stuff, Miyazaki, you know, all the popular manga of today would, probably not exist, or at least not exist in the form that it does.
Yeah, yeah, no, I know that you have looked at comics before in your work. I know that you've done documentaries about comic storytelling. How did comics become part of your story? How did you first get interested in them?
Well, I've always been a fan. I should probably say I haven't really done that much about comics. I did work on another person's film about queer comics, but I think there might be some confusion. Like some people have credited me with directing her film, and it was her
Producer,
film.
right? Producer.
Yeah, Vivian
Yeah.
Kleiman. I just really was more of like a consulting producer, I guess, or consultant on that film. But it was a great film and a great experience. But to answer your question, I've just always loved graphic novels and comics. Obviously going back to when I was a kid, like the only thing I would read was, Peanuts and Superman. And now I'm a big reader and I read everything. I read, history, I read novels and all of that, but I still kind of go back to reading when I really just want to read for pleasure. I'm mostly reading, graphic novels. And I just think it's a great art form, to be honest. And I just take a lot of issue with people who look down their noses at it and don't see it for the great art form that it is. I mean, I think that the quality of the storytelling and the quality of the artwork and what goes into making a great comic book or great graphic novel, I just think, you know, people who don't appreciate it just haven't put the effort into understanding it.
Agreed. I would absolutely agree. It's very complex,
Yeah.
lots of moving parts. Speaking of complexity, telling a story through film, documentary film, or any type of film is also complex. So, uh, curious about what film has allowed you to do and how you're kind of connecting there into the world of documentary.
Well, I've been making documentaries for over 2 decades. Um, and I mostly work in a kind of historical vein, I'd say. So I'm very comfortable in this world of sort of exploring the life of a creator like Osamu Tezuka, who was, um, we should probably get into this, but really
Mm.
one of the most insanely productive writers of all time, creators of all time, in terms of the amount of work that he created. I've done that with other artists. I made a film about Charles and Ray Eames, the design team, who were incredibly prolific artists themselves. They made films, they did installations, they made furniture, they built buildings, they did multimedia exhibitions. So I'm just, sort of, I'm fascinated by creative people and I like telling their story and I like working with, I like telling the story of people who worked in visual media because it's just so much easier to make a documentary about, a visual artist than it is to make one about a writer, for example. I've done that too. And it's much, much harder to make a film about, the inner life of a writer, for example, than an industrial designer or architect or a comic book writer because you just have so much more visual material to work with, and that's kind of the currency of documentary film is the visual material.
Yeah, yeah. Now you mentioned Tezuka and this mountain of work. We were talking about how there's so much to the world of manga. So, anything that you'd like to say about the influences that he's brought to the form?
It's almost impossible to know where to start,
Hmm.
he started creating, he was 17 years old when he first published. This was right after the war, so 1945. And he started with a little four-panel strip in the local Osaka newspaper that was actually quite popular. And um, he at the time was studying to become a doctor, and so the early part of his career, he was combining being, a comic book or a comics artist with basically studying to get a medical degree. And he went all the way to getting his medical degree and interning at a hospital, actually. He's a doctor. He was a doctor. Um, but he, at the same time, he was this, um, becoming this very successful um, uh, comics creator in the Osaka area. And at some point, he kind of had to make a decision about which direction he was going to go. And I mean, I don't know if it's apocryphal, but the story goes that a doctor who was sort of mentoring him at the hospital said, you could save a lot of lives if you quit being a doctor and focused on just doing your manga. So that's what he did. But so this goes back to like right after the war, 1945, when there was very little in terms of a comic book industry in Japan. It had essentially shut down during not just the war period, but several years prior to that. Like remember, like what we think of as the war period is 41 to 45. But the Japanese think of it as a much longer period because they were involved in China and Korea and Southeast Asia. Um, so during that period, there was sort of the militarization of Japanese society, and comic books were considered frivolous. They were considered, unpatriotic. It was considered a waste of, youthful energy, And so he was not like there really was not much going on during that time period. So when the war ended and he started working in comic books, he was kind of like part of a revival of what was sort of a dead art form essentially in Japan. You think about in America during that same period, during the war period, like Superman and stuff was, a really vital part of American culture, right? I mean, it
Hmm.
was like part of the war effort. Like it was part of how, sort of stoking, patriotic fervor. Um, but in Japan, it was quite different. It was basically, there was a certain amount of like patriotic. I'm sorry, I'm going to
No
kill my
worries.
phone. I can probably cut in there. Um,
Yep, no worries, no worries.
in Japan, it was quite different, and they didn't, there was a certain amount of, uh, purely patriotic comic book stuff, but it wasn't like for entertainment. And so he was part of the revival of that And he was really the first one in Japan to create long form storytelling in the comic book form using what we think of as cinematic techniques. In other words, the um, the action doesn't all take place on sort of a single plane with no, quote unquote camera movement. He was the first one to like really put in the kinds of motion techniques and sort of camera angle techniques that we're familiar with from film to put them into comic book format in Japan, where you have, a person driving a car and you'll see the wide shot, and then you'll push in, close on the driver's face as he's looking out the windshield, and then maybe his hands, and, you know, multiple camera angles to like really build a sense of tension and feeling and of being in the place.
Hmm.
So he would do in, 2 or 3 or 4 pages what previously you would expect to do in just 1 or 2 frames. He was really stretching it out, and it became a sensation. So like the first book that he did that in was one called Shin Takarajima, which basically translates to New Treasure Island, and it had like no marketing whatsoever. This was just, this was, remember, Japanese society was kind of um, destroyed after the war. The economy was in shambles, and people would just kind of set up shops and were selling stuff kind of willy-nilly. But he still managed to sell like 400,000 copies of that book, and it was almost all in Osaka. I guess a little bit made it up to Tokyo. But what he was doing was so revolutionary that it created the manga boom. And so, you basically get a generation of artists who came after him who all cite Shin Takarajima, New Treasure Island, as being this sort of eureka moment for them, this revelation. Um, and they all decided to become that they wanted to be, manga artists like Tezuka. Um, so, the other thing I think to keep in mind is that Japan being very, very poor at that time. Um, it was before television. Most people didn't have radios. Very few people could afford to go to movies. So manga really became the form of sort of media of entertainment, especially for kids, who really needed to be entertained after the war. And it really kind of took off as a result of the, some of the early stuff he did, mostly in sort of a science fiction vein. It was like sort of science fiction adventure stories for boys. But then he started expanding, creating more genres all the time. Like he kind of created what's known as shoujo manga, which is young girls manga, with a very popular manga series he did called Princess Knight, which really kind of created the whole, like a lot of the tropes from manga. And now shoujo manga is like one of the biggest genres in
Hmm.
manga, very popular with boys and girls. Um, yeah, I just don't think it's an understatement or an overstatement at all to say that, he created the modern manga industry after the war.
Yeah, yeah. Now I know that a documentary is a process and a journey. So curious about any conversations or artifactual experiences that you've had so far that have been enlightening that people might look forward to in the final product.
Um, Yeah, it's been really fun because sort of the first phase of production, um, a lot of it has focused on interviewing some of the legendary figures who were influenced by Tezuka when they were young, so going back to the, 50s and 60s. So that includes Yoshiyuki Tomino, who created the Gundam series. It includes Otomo, who of course created Akira and Domu. Um, Ryoko Ikeda, who created Rose of Versailles, people like that. Masao Maruyama, who worked with him in his animation studio before going on to create Mad Men animation studio and was basically Satoshi Kon's producer. You know, really one of the, I mean, I think you'd have to make the argument that he's the great a anime producer. So yeah, I've been able to interview some like just really legendary, iconic figures, and it's been an amazing experience. I mean, they're funny, they're charming, they just have great stories, and I think they've all kind of been wrestling in a way with Tezuka's legacy, because it's so sort of central to the story of both manga and anime that they're all in their own individual ways sort of wrestling with uh, what he meant to them, what he meant to their career. In some cases, he worked with them very directly. With Tomino and Maruyama, both really got their starts working in his production company. In other cases, it was more just sort of inspiration. In some cases, it was even kind of negative inspiration, you might say, like, you know, people wanting to do something different. And Tezuka was such a monumental figure in that world that doing something different meant being the anti-Tezuka, like trying to, you know, be not Tezuka. And so we've had some really interesting conversations around that too.
Yeah, yeah. If I'm a listener and I'm not as familiar with the world of manga, if I'm just sort of scratching the surface, what's maybe a look for me or a takeaway that I can expect in the documentary?
Well, I hope that people will get a sense of how central he was to the creation of this, very big now industry, comic books and animation. He created the first really, independent um, animation studio in Japan and the first, televised cartoons, Japanese televised cartoons, which then were exported all over the world. So I think that's obvious. But I think there's sort of a human story with him too that I'm really interested in exploring, which is about his own struggles. Um, I think he was a very emotional guy and very competitive. He was very, he came through the war experience and the post-war experience, which was very difficult for everybody, obviously. But he had a very powerful need to be on top at all times, to be like the number one selling, the most popular. He had been, dubbed the god of manga at a pretty young age, and he wanted to stay the god of manga. And it wasn't always easy to do that. And there were like long periods that he called his slumps, and he was actually quite open about it. He would even write about it in his some of his more introspective comic books. He would talk about his slumps and the sort of depression that it would send him into, these sort of kind of deep spirals that he would go into, where he was really struggling to keep up with the trends as younger artists were coming in and doing, work that was, sort of anti-Tezuka work. He didn't necessarily like it at first, but he wanted to be receptive to the audience, and then he would try to like adjust his style to what was popular in the marketplace. And sometimes he was really unsuccessful. Sometimes, over time he became more and more successful at it and really actually quite great at it. But I think that's really an interesting story too, of like, as an older guy, like when he was in his 50s and he was trying to work more in a mode like guys who were in their 20s, um, and what he was able to, create out of that, his own sort of hybrid, I think is really fascinating.
Yeah, yeah. Well, looking forward to seeing the finished product. Anything that you'd like to say? I know there's a Kickstarter coming up, so anything that you'd like to say about sort of where the process is in development at this point?
Sure. Yeah, well, I don't want to bore people with like the whole fundraising, thing because it's so boring, but I will say like we had like the way that I've usually made my films is through the National Endowment for the Humanities, which is, the federal government, and it's always been a really amazing source of funding for humanities, history, documentaries. And it's kind of, to be honest, like one of probably the only way for a high quality history oriented or art oriented, arts and culture type documentary to get made in America because there's just not a lot of money for it outside of the National Endowment for the Humanities. We got a nice grant from them for production in 2024, and that was really exciting. But then the whole Doge thing happened. I don't know if you remember that, but Elon Musk came in and in theory was going to save the American taxpayer all this money, and they basically canceled all of the grants that were had been awarded um, under Biden in 2024. So we basically lost all of our money. So it was like a major setback. Um, uh, then an amazing thing happened, which is somebody found out about that. A guy named Glenn Fukushima, who is a Japanese American businessman who grew up as a son of a soldier um, in the US Army stationed in Tokyo. So he grew up in Tokyo and he used to watch Astro Boy, which was Tezuka's famous cartoon. And he would watch it on television as he was when he was a little kid, growing up on the base in Tokyo. And so he kind of came to my rescue and he gave me some money so that I've been able to continue filming for the last 12 months or so. So that's how we've been able to keep going. But we are, as you were kind enough to mention, we're launching a Kickstarter campaign probably in the next 3 weeks to a month. So look for that in May. You can actually, maybe you can put up a link, but you can go and sign up now for notifications. There's like a pre-launch page for it right now, and we're accepting emails so that when the actual Kickstarter happens, you'll be notified. And there's going to be like really killer rewards associated with that. We're getting original illustrations from some really major artists who are all big fans of Tezuka, and we got permission from the Tezuka estate and Tezuka Productions for these artists to do their own versions of Tezuka characters. So these are like really one of a kind collectible things that are going to be super cool to have.
Nice, nice. Other than the Kickstarter page, are there other spaces online that you would recommend that listeners go to follow your work and find out more?
Not yet. No, we'll be putting up a website at some point. Our production company website is breadandbutterfilms.com, but there's not much up yet about the Tezuka project. We'll be doing that soon.
Oh, cool. Have we missed anything that you want to make sure to include about the project? Anything from the world of manga, or any story about the guitar behind you? I feel like it's been watching us this entire time.
Well, okay, so there is a story with that guitar. When I was living in Japan, I was a lot of the way that I lived there, I made money was playing guitar on the street, just singing, Beatles songs and Bob Dylan songs and stuff like that to sort of pay my bills while I was studying Japanese. And that was the guitar that I used. And I bought that guitar because it was really flashy. And I thought that having a really flashy guitar would help me, attract people. It worked pretty good.
Nice, nice. That is the plan. Um,
I don't know, man. There's a
well,
lot to talk about with Tezuka, and we haven't really talked about the animation stuff. That's pretty interesting. He had two, he created an animation company called Mushi Productions in 1962, And all he knew was that he wanted to make animation. He had no sort of plan for how to make money with it. But he was so successful as a comic book writer, as a manga writer, that he was able to like fund it. So he built the studio, hired all of these young guys away from Toho, which was the big sort of corporate animation studio in Japan. And they all just kind of got together and they were doing like sort of experimental animation for film festivals. Just some kind of wacky stuff that had no real commercial viability whatsoever. But he was so obsessed with animation. He grew up watching like Fleischer Brothers stuff, Disney stuff. He loved American animation, and he wanted to kind of create like the Walt Disney of the, Disney Studios of Japan. But he didn't really have a plan for how to do it. And they were just basically just bleeding money. Like, all of his money from his manga sales were going into this animation studio with like no revenue coming in. And then at some point, somebody goes, I think this television thing is really going to happen. Like maybe we should try doing, television cartoons. And he had this very successful manga at the time, which was called Tetsuan Atom, Astro Boy. And they said, why don't we try doing Tetsuan Atom as a cartoon? And so they got Fuji TV to agree to give him like very, very little money. Like, I mean, it's sort of a famous story, but like the original contract, it's something like $5,000, like in today's money per 22-minute episode is what they were doing. And so they had to create, sort of techniques and processes for doing animation on the super cheap. Sort of taking a lot of the techniques that American animation, television animation, like Hanna-Barbera was doing, with the Flintstones and stuff like that.
Mhm.
But even way cheaper. Like first of all, it was black and white, not color. Um, but like far fewer frames per second. Um, just really, uh, much more like still images with camera moves on still images. A lot of the things that we now associate with anime as a style, as a sort of stylistic form, that all emerged out of like the economic necessity of making 22 minutes for like almost no money.
Mm.
And the crazy thing is that now that style is becoming kind of more dominant. It's passed on to uh, Western animation studios that are now copying Japanese animation because they like the look, they like the look, and it's a sort of it's a focus on storytelling instead of a focus on, sort of realism and fluidity, all of that stuff that, Disney was all about. Like, can we make it just super fluid and beautiful and realistic? Like the Japanese um, variant on animation wasn't focused on those things. Like fluidity isn't really as important. There's a lot of just like static images. Um, but what matters is the storytelling, and the storytelling's great.
It's amazing how there are these chains of inspiration and chains of influence. So even if someone's not as familiar with manga, there are those elements that have touched so much of comics and film and animation that the moves are there, even if kind of the history is hidden or lesser
Mhm.
known.
Yeah, somebody described it as like a Mobius strip of
Mhm.
of influence that goes back and forth between the West and Japan. And sometimes it's really hard to tell who's influencing who at this point. It definitely goes both ways. And I was actually just somebody kind of emailed me out of the blue. I guess they saw the Kickstarter campaign, and this guy emailed me from Chile, and he wrote an article where he proposes the term Tezukism to relate to that sort of new kind of art form, this new sort of mode of creating comics and animation where it's essentially Western. It's being done by Western artists, but it's very much in a Japanese mode or an Asian mode. Um, I thought it's pretty interesting, but I think that that's very much what's happening right now. It's a total sort of global merging of these styles. But I think that, overall, you'd kind of have to say that the Japanese aesthetic is more dominant right now than the Western aesthetic. Like
Mhm.
I think that people are, I still love Pixar movies. Personally, I think they're pretty great, but I think it's that style is a little bit less influential right now than what's coming out of Japan.
And as a member of fandom, anyone who's in fandom right now, we have these connections. It's no longer kind of like Akira Kurosawa bootleg fandom. It's really more known and globalized that way. So if you want to connect to a thread of something, it's a pretty open avenue to follow.
Yeah, do you think that's cool, or do you think that it's a little bit sad that it's lost a little bit of its like kind of, you know,
Well,
you have to go hunting for it. You don't have to go hunting for it as much anymore.
there is a joy in the hunt, but I also love the idea that we can kind of have these open channels, and people can find out. And if you want to read something, it's pretty accessible in
Mhm.
most cases. So hopefully your film brings light to even more of that, and people can engage in more of the hunt.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, I really hope that people walk away, sort of thinking about him in the canon that he deserves to be in, along with Miyazaki, along with Walt Disney, along with, Stan Lee and, Kirby, those
Mhm.
guys like Charles Schultz, I, I just think it's kind of crazy that people don't know his name. Um, his influence is, at least on a par with all of those people. So if I accomplish that, I'll be very happy.
And as you said, we would have no Miyazaki in the form that we've had it, or
Mhm.
had Miyazaki without Tezuka. So
Yeah.
I'm glad to be part of sharing that conversation, and I'm glad you're doing the work that you're doing.
Well, thanks so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to your fans.